Hello, friends. This is Lakshmi here with you today with a very interesting poem titled Small Scale Reflections on a Great House, written by the poet A.K. Ramanujan. A.K. Ramanujan is a poet and a folklorist, a critic, and a translator. I have spoken about him in a couple of other videos. I think I've done the poem Ecology by him, and again there is the poem called A River, and another one too which I cannot remember. And so I guess I am not going to talk much about the poet this time. So let me just tell you a significant fact which has colored all his poems. Uh, the fact that he spent a great part of his life outside India because he was a teacher of Dravidian studies and linguistics, South Asian languages and civilization and anthropology at the University of Chicago in USA. Having spent many years abroad, had an impact on his outlook on life and the world. And therefore, in his works, we often see that there is a fusion of native culture and the detachment of a Westerner. His Indian and American experiences impact on his writing. There is often a very unique because you don't find this in many other poets, a unique amalgamation of the tradition and the modern. And he tries to attain a balance between the two. His works are rooted in Indian experiences, but they have a transnational outlook. And it is his life as a Westerner which has given him a very um, anti sentimental approach to life. We know that we Indians are very sentimental and emotional. In his poetry, we generally do not find much of a tenderness. He is pretty open and candid and often rude in his expression of what he feels. All that is attributed to his experiences as a Westerner who lived outside India for a long time. So let us see how many of these qualities we can see in this particular poem that I have taken up for discussion. The title is very interesting: Small Scale Reflections on a Great House. So, this is a very interesting poem and it is written in a comic, ironic tone. It is unrhymed and is written in free verse. There are 91 lines in all. He talks about his ancestral home. He is, of course, nostalgic about the house, the people who lived there, his experiences there. So he has a very Indian attachment to the past. But then the Westerner in him stops him from being too sentimental. So he expresses his nostalgia in a very nonchalant manner. Let's see how he does this. Since this is a very long poem, let me just take a few lines at a time. So, this is how the poem begins. Sometimes I think that nothing that ever comes into this house goes out. Things that come in every day, to lose themselves among other things lost long ago, among other things lost long ago. So he says that, so this house, this ancestral house of his, it has the quality of retaining things that come into it. It doesn't allow anything to go out. And so things that come in every day lose themselves among other things lost long ago, among other things lost long ago. So the story of things getting lost among things lost earlier is not a new story. That is what has been happening in this house for a long time. It's very interesting the way he puts it. And it also reminds me uh, of myself and of my grandparents, my parents, who all have this habit of clinging to objects, of this reluctance to throw away things. That is why we have so much of clutter in our homes. And when I have read very tips on how to declutter your home, and one of the things that one of the one point that is highlighted there is that if an object is has not been used for at least 6 months, it means that you can do without it, so throw it away. But we don't do that generally. Whatever comes in, you find a way not to throw it off, even if it is a plastic, uh, a container in which you bring your takeaway home. What happens is that you would try to find some use for it. You think that you can use it to store something. Maybe you can, something or the other. Be very creative when it comes to that. And so, most of us have kitchens cluttered with um, absolutely unnecessary things because you are reluctant to throw it off. That's exactly what happens here too. So he's all sorts of things come and they kind of settle down, they become a part of this house. And this list, it starts with live things like lame wandering cows to in-laws, to sons-in-law and daughters-in-law. It goes on to a list of inanimate things. So let's go through that interesting list. Lame wandering cows from nowhere have been known to be tethered, given a name, encouraged to get pregnant in the broad daylight of the street under the elder's supervision. The girls hiding behind windows with holes in them. So then he says that wandering cows, lame ones, who maybe have been chased out of their homes because they are useless, or animals that have been lost, they all find a haven in this house. So the wandering cows, they come, they are maybe fed in the beginning, and then they become apart. They decide to stay back there, and they're tethered to a tree somewhere in the house. And then slowly, everybody in the house gets fond of this new arrival, and they give it a name. They call her by a new name. She's fed well, she's taken care of. And then the elders, they decide to, since this is a cow, they decide to see whether she can get pregnant and give birth to a calf. And so they arrange for this cow to get pregnant, and this procedure goes on under the supervision of the elders in broad daylight. And girls, young girls, are not expected to see this because it would give them ideas, and so they are asked to stay indoors, and from their hideouts inside the house they peek through holes and see what is happening outside. All this is a part of the life that goes on in this house. And unread library books usually mature in 2 weeks and begin to lay a row of little eggs in the ledgers for fines. As silverfish in the old man's office room breed dynasties among long legal words in the succulence of Victorian parchment. And then the next thing in the list is library books. You have unread library books, somebody or the other. Now, those days, people lived in joint families, where, as opposed to the nuclear families that we have now, with just the father, mother, and a child or two. But earlier, in big houses, they had so many people staying there, especially if one of the relatives is a rich and affluent enough to support the others. All the poor relatives will slowly gravitate towards this house and leave their children there on the pretext of joining a college nearby or finding a job somewhere. Or maybe you can keep her here because she doesn't have anything to eat at home. So somehow or the other, a lot of people, they end up spending their life in this house. And so here we have these library books. One or the other of them might borrow a book from the library and then leave it somewhere, forget about the book. And the unread library books, they mature in 2 weeks. Now, 2 weeks is usually the reading time, the time, the borrowing time that is given that is permitted by lending libraries. And I guess that is by what he means by 2 weeks. So they are supposed to be returned in 2 weeks, but then they are kept in some forgotten corner and nobody remembers them after that. And maybe the person who brought this book gets married and she goes off somewhere, or um, the young student. Maybe he has joined some other course, something or the other. You always have reasons to forget such things. And so the books lie there, and they begin to lay a row of little eggs in the ledgers for fines. That is, in the library where the book is accounted for, there in the ledger, there would be a small, maybe circles drawn to show that the book has not yet been returned. That is what I guess he talks about, little eggs in the ledgers for fines. A ledger is the big register. So these little eggs in the ledgers are again compared to the eggs of silverfish. So these little eggs in the ledgers for fines are compared to the eggs of silverfish in the old man's room. That is maybe the head of the family who's a lawyer, and uh, in within the pages of his legal books and documents, you have the silverfish laying eggs and breeding dynasties among the legal words in the succulence of Victorian parchment. And these silverfish, they very happily feed on the Victorian parchment, or the thick paper on which the document is printed, and they flourish in the safety of the closed pages. So you can see the silverfish, which is again very common in cluttered homes. All that is drawn into this picture. And then he talks about another object that comes and doesn't go back. Neighbors' dishes brought up with the greasy sweets they made all night the day before yesterday for the wedding anniversary of a god. Never leave the house they enter, like the servants, the phonographs, the epilepsies and the blood, the sons in law who quite forget their mothers, but stay to check accounts or teach arithmetic to nieces. So the list doesn't end there. So he says that the plates, the dishes that people bring, neighbors might bring when there is a feast or the anniversary of a god. Now you know that in Indian villages there are any number of festivities related to the temples and the gods, and you have Vinayaka Chaturthi and um, uh, Vijayadashami and Durgashtami and so many things happening. And so the neighbors, those days, they used to sit up and make sweets the previous night, because the ready-made sweets were not easily available as they are now, and they were pretty expensive too, and people would prefer to make sweets or all these sweetmeats at home. Home cooked food was definitely considered to be better than what you would buy from a stall. And so people used to bring greasies, and they have this habit of this practice of exchanging things, that is also very common. If you have a Christian family nearby, I don't think that in this particular poem they're talking about Christians or Muslims, but from my experience, if you have a neighbor who's a Muslim, when they have a festival, they would bring you biryani or kheer or something. And when it is the time of Onam or Vishu, you um, give them paisam or whatever you make here. And when it is Christmas, a Christian friend brings cake for you. And this happens. And so here, these neighbors, they bring sweets, and the small dishes in which these greasy sweets come are in most cases not returned. And this is not done intentionally, but then you tend to forget. And then again, the servants. Uh, Gone are the times actually of servants who stayed back in your houses, because today you don't find such people. Earlier, I remember when I was a child too, I have seen housemaids who live in your house with you, live in housemaids. And when you go to other places too, you hear people talking about housemaids who uh, spend the entire life in that particular house. When the a lady, when a young girl is married, sometimes along with her dowry, you sometimes have a maid servant also accompanying her, and that maid servant happens to stay there. And then when she comes of age, she is married to somebody who also stays there, and then they have children who also stay there, and it used to go on like that. And sometimes, in some cases, these servants, they don't get married, and they remain maidens or bachelors forever, and they continue to be a part and parcel of this family. They slowly become a family member who don't have, or who have forgotten their own families. So here, this can also be added to the list. The servants, the phonographs. The phonographs are the old-fashioned record players. The instrument where you could reproduce sounds by the vibration of a stylus or a needle. That is the phonograph. And again, he mixes all sorts of things: humans, animals, books, servants, phonographs. And then he says epilepsy is in the blood. That is another thing that comes into the family and doesn't go out, in the sense that genetic diseases like or disorders like epilepsy, which is there in the blood, which is transmitted from one generation to the next. And then sons in law who get married, especially if this is an affluent family, and the sons-in-law come from a less affluent family. In often in such cases, the sons-in-law also end up staying in this house, and they forget their mothers and stick on here, but they stay back to check accounts. Either they take up the job of checking the accounts or of this house, or teach arithmetic to nieces or the young children in the family, in the joint family. And then again, there are women who come as wives, that is, the daughters in law, from houses open to on one side to rising suns, on another to the setting. So these are, I guess, he is talking about the traditional houses built as per Vastu Shastra, where the entrance of the house always faces the east, or the direction where the sun rises, and the back side faces the west. So traditional houses built according to Vastu. So women, young women who grow up in very traditional and conservative homes, and who are married to very traditional conservative homes, and who are destined to become a part of the houses into which they are married. And in India, again, we have this belief that once a woman is married, she has to sever all her ties with her family, and has to become a part of the husband's family. And in some extreme cases, I have even heard of women having to give up their maiden names and take up a new name when they get married. So he's talking about all that, he's blending all that into this. And so he talks about women who come as wives from houses open on one side of to rising suns, and on other to the setting, accustomed to wait and to yield to monsoons in the mountains calendar, beating through the hanging banana leaves. So women who are accustomed to suffer anything, to mold themselves according to their new circumstances. And he also talks about the hanging banana leaves, which is an inevitable item when you talk about South India. And also, anything that goes out will come back. And so he now, in the first few lines, he gave us a list of things that come into the house and do not go out. And similarly, he says there is a reverse trend of anything that goes out bounces back and finds its way back. Now he gives us a list of such items. And also, anything that goes out will come back, processed and often with long bills attached, like the hooped bales of cotton shipped off to invisible Manchesters and brought back milled and folded for a price. Cloth for our day's middle class loins, and muslin for our richer nights. So he begins the list with hooped bales of cotton, because in those days, during the colonial times, India was a place which produced a lot of cotton, and Indian cotton was considered to be of fine quality. And at that time, there was a lot of exploitation by Britain, and all the good cotton from India was shipped away exported to Britain. And the cloth made of this cotton, which was taken away from India, was woven into material, into cotton, fine cotton material, and it came back to India as an expensive item with very huge price tags attached. So here he is poking fun at the colonial practice of exploitation, where the colonies were exploited, where they were bled white. So, like hoop bales of cotton. Manchester, of course, we know is the industrial city in London, which had a lot of factories, textile manufacturing industries. So, the cotton which goes off from India to invisible Manchester's come back, milled and folded for a price. And we Indians use them uh, as a daily clothes, for a daily dresses, and as muslin, which is a thinner version for the night wear. Letters mailed have a way of finding their way back, with many redirections to wrong addresses and red ink marks earned in Tiruvalla and Sialkot. So again, letters, that is another item which sometimes come back. When you send it, maybe the sender is not to be found in that address, and so the letter is redirected. Maybe a neighbor would redirect it to the sender's new address. It might go there, it doesn't find the person there, it is redirected to many post offices, and it has got red ink marks and seals all over, and finally it comes back to the person who sent it. And so you have ink marks earned in Tiruvalla. Tiruvalla is a place in Kerala. Sialkot is a place in Pakistan. So letters, maybe letters, or it may also be a reference to family members who had left the house to go to various places, to settle down in various places, and then finally, when they're old, we know that people who settle abroad often desire to spend after they make enough money, after they're well settled. They always prefer to come back home, to die in their own soil, amongst their friends and family. So, this might be a reference to family members who drift back after long sojourns in far off countries. And then another thing that comes back is are the ideas which actually sprung from here, but then they go out and they gather flesh and blood and finally come back in new forms. And ideas behave like rumors, once casually mentioned somewhere. They come back to the door as prodigies born to prodigal fathers, with eyes that vaguely look like our own, like what Uncle said the other day, that every Plotinus we read is what some Alexander looted between the malarial rivers. So he says there are some stories, some rumors about some family members that goes around and gathers a lot of information, grows plumb, and comes back to the family. And it seems an uncle had once said that every Plotinus we read, Plotinus, when I referred, I found is a Greek philosopher, and I tried to find out what exactly the connection is between Alexander the Great, because Alexander is the one who looted between the malarial rivers, that is the rivers of the east. We know that he came up to India, and so the malarial rivers are a reference to the rivers of the east, where malaria, mosquito infested, and where malaria was common. And we also know that Alexander died of some such illness as a fever. And there is no visible connection between Plotinus and this particular Alexander, whereas there is another Alexander who's a philosopher, and there is a link there. But though I can't exactly place these two people together, what he means is that Plotinus too wrote about the Eastern philosophy and Eastern ideas. So maybe he got it from the books that Alexander looted and took back to Greece. Maybe that's the connection, a very vague kind of a, yoking of ideas. But then the thing is that what he's trying to say is that rumors which start small in the house They spread like wildfire and come back to us in a different form altogether. And then he talks about people who come to the house. A beggar once came with a violin to croak out a prostitute's song that a voiceless cook sang all the time in our backyard. So he talks about a song which was sung by a beggar with a violin. It was a prostitute song, means a good for nothing song, maybe uh, a bad song, maybe a kind of an abusive song, and our voiceless cook in the sense that maybe a cook who couldn't really sing, who did not have the sweet voice of a singer, but she used to sing that song, she or he, because those days we also had a lot of male cooks too. And so the cook used to sing. So the song which came wandering with a beggar now stayed back in the house, and the cook used to sing it whenever he was in a mood. Nothing stays out. Daughters get married to short lived idiots. So sometimes he says nothing stays out, in the sense that daughters who are sent to their husband's home sometimes come back, especially when they are married to short lived idiots. You can see that he has no respect for the in laws, the brothers in law that he has. And so the daughters who become widowed very young, they come back. Sons who run away come back, in grandchildren who recite Sanskrit to approving old men. And sometimes you have young men running away from home, finding a life elsewhere, getting married, settling elsewhere, and finally later they come back with their children who know Sanskrit, and they kind of show off in front of the old men, the elders, saying that my child can speak Sanskrit, and the child recites Sanskrit verses, and it pleases the older men because most of the Hindu prayers were written in Sanskrit, and it was considered a credit, especially in Brahmin families, if their children could recite mm, Sanskrit prayers. And so the sons who wander, they get married and they come back with children who know Sanskrit to show that they haven't forgotten or severed their tie with the roots, that they bring up their children too in the same way that they were brought up. Or bring betel nuts for visiting uncles who keep them gaping with anecdotes of unseen fathers. So there are cases sometimes these visiting there are these visiting uncles, and these grandchildren of runaway sons, they listen to all sorts of stories, anecdotes from the visiting uncles about their unseen fathers. So some of the sons who ran away, maybe they died, and maybe their wives come back with their children to their husband's home because they have nowhere else to go. In such cases, these visiting uncles, when they know that this child is the son of such a person, they start reeling out anecdotes. Now anecdotes, can be a mix of truth and a lot of imagination too. As years pass by, you tend to add more and more color to anecdotes because they pass down from one generation to the next, and so they regale the children with stories, anecdotes, interesting stories of their unseen fathers. Or sometimes these young people, they come back to bring Ganges water in a copper pot for the last of the dying ancestors, rattle in the throat. So then sometimes these young men who leave their homes, they are informed that their parents or grandparents are dying, and that you have to come back and you have to be the one to pour the last drop of the Ganges water, which was considered holy water. So before they die, the last thing that should go in should be the water from the Ganga. And so these young men who left homes earlier would come back with copper pots in which you have the Ganges water preserved, so that they can pour it down the rattling throats of the dying ancestors. And he says that uh, he mentioned daughters coming back after the husbands are dead, or sons coming back after many years with their children, or grandchildren coming back after their fathers are dead. And now he also says that there have been one or two instances of family members returning as dead bodies or corpses. And though many times from everywhere, recently only twice, once in 1943 from as far as the Sahara, half gnawed by desert foxes, and lately from somewhere in the north, a nephew with stripes on his shoulder was called an incident on the border and was brought back in plane and train and military truck even before the telegrams reached on a perfectly good chatty afternoon. So he says this has happened many a time, but in recent times it's just twice, once in 1943, and at that time, one of the relatives, the dead bodies were brought back from Sahara, far away Sahara, and the body was half eaten by the desert foxes. And uh, even recently, a soldier, a nephew who was a soldier, and he had stripes on his shoulders in the sense that he held a position in the army. He had a rank in the army, and so he was killed in the border, and his body was brought back with great respect in the plane and in the train and the military truck, even before the telegram reached informing the family about his death. The body was brought on a perfectly good chatty afternoon. So the family members were not expecting this in the least. They were all sitting around chatting, and then suddenly comes this truck, the military truck, with the dead body of this young man. So in this poem, you see a lot of things, a lot of incidents, a lot of references, which are all part of this Indianness, what we call the Indian fabric. And almost everything that he mentions here can be easily related to by the older ones amongst us, maybe up to my generation. We easily relate to this because we too have lived in such ancestral houses, at least spent vacations in, in such houses where joint families lived. So many people lived together, sometimes in disharmony, but most of the time in great harmony. And there was so much of fun and laughter and sorrow sometimes, deaths and births. And all these incidents that I mentioned, we can easily relate to. But I guess the people of the new generation might find many of these things quite strange. Letters coming back with red stamps all over them. I have seen it, but I don't think my son has seen that. And so many things in this poem. Yeah, this poem, though Ramanujan tries to stand aloof as a detached observer, as a Westerner viewing the Eastern world with mild scorn, in spite of all that, we can see that there is the sense of nostalgia for a time past and a desperate clutching to the past, which will soon be irredeemably lost due to the change of attitudes and the change of times. People coming in the next generation or after that, I don't think they would even understand what Ramanujan is talking about. But for me and for many of my contemporaries, this is a delightful poem, perfectly relatable. And this is one of the most entertaining poems of Ramanujan, I should say. And I enjoy it each and every time I read it. And I could, I hope I've succeeded in conveying something of, of the spirit of the poem to the listeners. So thank you for listening to me.